Jaak Panksepp was the first and only neuroscientist who focused squarely on the emotional brain. There was a lengthy and instructive series of emails between Jaak and Lucy Biven, our next guest, that ultimately resulted in the publication of the famous book, The Archeology of Mind. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity today to speak with Lucy Biven, who co-authored The Archeology of Mind with the one and only Jaak Panksepp. Those who study the field of neuroscience will know his name, and if you haven't heard of him, I hope this episode sheds some light on his work, combined with Lucy's, as pioneer researchers in the field of affective neuroscience. Welcome back to the Neuroscience Meets Social and Emotional Learning podcast, where we bridge the gap between theory and practice with strategies, tools, and ideas we can all use immediately applied to the most current brain research to heighten productivity in our schools, sports environments, and modern workplaces. I'm Andrea Samadi and launched this podcast almost 4 years ago to share how important an understanding of our brain is for everyday life and results. This season, Season 9, will be focused on neuroscience going back to the basics for the next few months as we've welcomed some phenomenal pioneers in the field of neuroscience at the start of this year, paving a pathway for all of us to navigate our lives with more understanding with our brain in mind. My goal with this next season, that will run until the end of June, is that by going back to the basics, it will help us to all strengthen our understanding of our brain and our mind to our results and provide us with a springboard to propel us forward in 2023 with this solid backbone of science. With some new and exciting responsibilities on my end, we'll be doing one episode a week, going back to the basics each week that I know will be helpful for all of us. For today's guest, and episode number 270, we'll be speaking with someone who many of you who study in the field of neuroscience will recognize. There are those who I would call rock star researchers whose work has revolutionized the field. If you take a neuroscience course, or like I did, a neuroscience certification program, if you're a clinician, a psychotherapist, you will have come across her first book as required reading. Metapsychology Online Review thinks this book should be essential reading, not only for mind professionals, but for teachers, parents, personal and physical trainers, and coaches. So when I had an email from this next guest, one of these rock star authors we come across and highlight in our notebooks, letting me know that she's recently published a new book and that her first book she co-authored with Jaak Panksepp, I almost fell off my chair in my office. She could have been Mick Jagger emailing me, as that would be the equivalent in the field of neuroscience research. Her first book, The Archeology of Mind, that she co-authored with Jaak Panksepp, describes the new scientific discipline called Affective Neuroscience, which seeks to illuminate how our most powerful emotional feelings, the primal emotional effects, arise from ancient neural networks situated in brain regions below the neocortical thinking cap, or basically how our emotions show up in our brain. I've put some reviews in the show notes from some famous researchers that you might recognize, but let's learn more about our next guest, Lucy Biven, who co-authored The Archeology of Mind with Jaak Panksepp. She's the former head of Department of Psychotherapy at the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, part of National Health Service from England. She became interested in neuroscience about 20 years ago when she was appointed by the Michigan Supreme Court to devise and implement a protocol for the transfer of custody of a 2.5-year-old girl from the home of a couple that the child regarded as her parents to the home of her biological parents. Like most of her colleagues, Lucy worried about the little girl's psychological development, yet the child progressed well and today is an emotionally healthy young woman. So where did it all go right? She looked towards neuroscience for the answers that she was looking for and found that, along with meeting Jaak Panksepp, who coined the term affective neuroscience, which is the field that studies the neural mechanisms of emotions and how, again, they map out in the brain. My goal with this next interview is to learn directly from Lucy Biven how an understanding of our emotions and our brain can help us to be better teachers in the classroom, better coaches in the field of sports, or improve our effectiveness as a manager in the modern workplace. Her most recent book that we'll talk about today, A Shortcut to Understanding Affective Neuroscience, was released last summer, and I look forward to learning what this rock star from the field of psychology and neuroscience can teach us with her work, her research, and her experience. Let's welcome Lucy Biven. Welcome, Lucy. Thank you so much for reaching out to me when you did. It was perfect timing for the direction that we're going on this podcast, going back to the basics of neuroscience. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Absolutely. Well, you know how excited I am. And just to start out with, I wondered, what type of reaction do you typically get when you reach out to people and you say, oh, by the way, I happen to have been the one that co-authored the book with Jaak Panksepp, The Archeology of Mind. Do most people know that book and who Jaak Panksepp is, or what happens?
Well, you're the first one who's responded so far. So wow. I don't know. I can't tell you.
Well, I've got all these notes about understanding the 7 core emotions, and I've never done a podcast on it because I didn't have a handle of it. And so I read your book very carefully, and I hope that this interview will help me to gain the understanding so that I can definitely explain it to others and help others along the way. So I'm so excited for this. Thank you for being here.
Let's go.
All right, absolutely. So I always like to know what brought people to where they are now. And you actually explain it in the introduction of your book, A Shortcut to Understanding Affective Neuroscience. But can you give our listeners a snapshot of your career path so I don't think that I was crazy that you came from England? What were you doing over there? And how did you get appointed by the Michigan Supreme Court to that case?
Well, I trained at the Anna Freud Center. It used to be called the Hampstead Clinic. And it was a training in child and adolescent psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. And so I was just an ordinary psychotherapist, child and adolescent psychotherapist. It was good training, but I had no interest in neuroscience. In fact, I was a bit phobic about science in general because I'd never really studied it much beyond the basics. And then I got thrown into this case. Now, I don't know how I was appointed, to be honest. There were some other psychotherapists, psychoanalysts in Ann Arbor, which is where this happened, who were very involved in the case. I think they were very involved in dealing with the custodial parents. And one of them just called me and asked me would I help out in managing the transfer. And I said, sure. So that was it. I had nothing to do with it prior to that phone call.
And so then your book opens with that incredible case, an example of how neuroscience helped to inform the outcomes of that case with those children. Can you just explain what you saw that 19 experts in child development couldn't see without understanding how the brain works?
Well, I see it now. I didn't see it then. I was as worried as they were, frankly. But I became much less worried as I dealt with the case because it became clear to me that this little girl, she became very, very fond of her biological parents as she got to know them, because she had a series of visits with them in the presence of the custodial parents. Those were the people whom she regarded as her parents. And she got to love these people. But I stayed very much in the background, but she also liked me very much just because I was a benign presence. And I remember if she had problems with a toy or something like that, she would come over and crawl onto my lap, and I was a safe person too. And I thought, well, in terms of trauma, I could take her home and she wouldn't be traumatized with me. and she wasn't traumatized with them. So I thought to myself, well, how did this happen? We all had the opposite point of view. And I looked through the psychoanalytic literature and I found absolutely nothing that explained it. In fact, I found a number of articles which said the contrary. The only one who was the exception was Anna Freud herself. And she said that she felt that if a child was left in the company of adults whom he or she trusted, that they'd be okay and there wouldn't be a trauma. And that, in fact, was the case. A few other people agreed with her. And some people actually came up to me after the whole thing was over and said they agreed that the child would be all right. And they did this on the basis of their psychological understanding rather than their they didn't understand anything about neuroscience. Most people didn't at that time. And I certainly didn't. So, but I thought, well, what are the reasons? And I just couldn't figure it out. And so I turned to neuroscience. I was lucky. I read a popular book on neuroscience by a wonderful writer named George Johnson. I think it was called Palaces of Memory or something sort of funny like that. And he explained things so well. For example, he explained action potential, which is actually a very complicated mechanism. And I understood it. And that sort of made me less afraid. And because neuroscience is not that difficult, the names are sort of arcane. They're hard to remember that way. But if you apply just a little bit of patience, you can understand anything. I mean, I could.
Yeah. Yeah, if we could just go back and for the listeners that might not have, known the story. So you were appointed to this case because this, was she 2.5? A 2.5-year-old girl was to go back to her biological, and everyone was afraid that she was going to miss the other family. Yeah. And as a mom of 2 kids, this story really hit me because when we drop our kids off at daycare, when they're just very little, I started to think, did I make a mistake from leaving Canada where we had a year of maternity leave to spend with our kids? And now I'm dropping them after, I don't remember, I think we get 12 weeks, 3 months. Yeah. And it felt like nothing. And suddenly I'm dropping them off and going off to work. And it's a horrible feeling. It's like your heart's getting ripped out. And I was shocked to learn what you discovered, that the hippocampus creates enduring personal memories, but it doesn't function until the child is about 4 years old. I wish I knew that. Is that right?
I was a little wrong about that.
Okay.
A lot wrong about that. I found out a friend of mine sent me some research that I hadn't read before I wrote the book. Actually, the hippocampus comes online at about 2 years. But the reason why there aren't any memories before 4 years is that the prefrontal cortex, which creates ideas, is still very immature. So there aren't any ideas to remember. What they find is that there are sometimes certain sort of flash memories that are retained. Usually they're not spontaneously remembered. They can be remembered if there's a reminder of some sort. But in any case, I mean, certainly from a functional point of view, children don't have personal memories before the age of 4 years. That doesn't mean that they can't be damaged. They can be damaged in ways that they don't remember. So it depends who you drop your kids off with. If you drop your kids off with bad people, there might be damage, emotional damage. And we see that, with those, with lots of case studies, those children in Romania, the orphanage children. Now, they were given perfectly okay food and, physical care, but they didn't have any mother or father to take care of them. They didn't have any close relationship, and they didn't do well. And what can happen, one of the terrible things that can happen, is that there is a upregulation of the autonomic nervous system of the and an upper regulation of the HPA system, and that can result in the excessive secretion of cortisol. Cortisol can suppress the immune system, and a lot of these children died of infections. So it's horrible. Just because a child can't remember, don't think that you're scot-free. You still have to take care of them.
Exactly. And that brings me just to think of the book, What Happened to You? Like, when you're a teacher in the classroom and you've got these kids that, their autonomic nervous system's going haywire, you just don't know what happened to them in their lifetime, right?
I mean, for example, they did some studies with rats, and, subcortically, all mammals are very much the same. So this could easily be applied to all mammals, including us. But they found that when rats, let's say, were socially isolated, which is to say no maternal care, there were fewer opioid receptors in their brains. Now, opioids are the feel-good comfort chemicals. They're the ones that give you the warm fuzzy. And if you have fewer receptors in your brain, that means you have much less capacity to feel comforted, to feel good. And those rats, in fact, remained anxious, poorly socialized. They were bad parents for the rest of their lives. And so it can have a permanent effect.
Well, were there any other things that you noticed like that would have been really helpful for young parents to know about connecting neuroscience to our brain? Is there any? That's a pretty big one for us to know.
Well, to some extent, I think that the neuroscience that is out there that we know about conforms very well to everything that people know about good parenting, which is to say, even though a child doesn't remember, let's say you have, that patient that I wrote about at the end of the book, that little boy who was so phobic, he barely remembered what happened to him, but it somehow sensitized his fear system. Now, how did that work? I don't know. All I know is that there is research indicating that sensitization, and certainly fear sensitization, is a real thing. And his fear system had been so sensitized that he was afraid of lots of things. Anything that seemed even remotely dangerous, he would develop a fixation on it. I don't know if you've ever been mugged, or anybody who's listening has ever been mugged, but if something like that has happened to you, anybody will tell you that one of the worst things about it is it leaves you so jumpy and nervous that even when it's over, and even when you're probably never going to get mugged again, you can't calm down. It takes you a while.
It's interesting when you talk about it like that, because how you know yourself really well. I always freak out when people are behind me. I can't handle someone walking too closely behind me. It freaks me out on the hiking trails. I'll move over so someone can get by. I don't know what that is, but there's something there. I don't know.
I don't think most of us like that sort of thing. I certainly don't.
I always wondered, what happened to me in another lifetime, because I definitely nothing's happened that I at least remember, but it just freaks me out when someone's too close behind me. I'm like, what are you doing over there?
Yeah. Well, I think anyone who invades our personal space, it's not nice.
Right. All right. Well, what was it about Jaak Panksepp's work that filled in those missing gaps for you? For lay people like me and others listening, and the way you're describing this, it's putting me at such ease, because if you pick up Jaak's work, it's not easy to get through. I could not say I understood it enough to teach it to someone else. So what was it that filled in the gaps for you with it?
Well, I had been, since this case, I've been reading a lot about neuroscience, and I really got interested in it, and I started reading about it sort of for its own sake, rather than trying to figure out what I was, the questions that I had, rather than to answer them. So I wasn't getting anywhere, to be honest. I read a book by Joseph Ledoux, fascinating, wonderful book called The Emotional Brain, and I thought, great, I've got it, the emotional brain. It didn't tell me anything. It told me the research, I can't tell you, is absolutely elegant. And it's absolutely, I recommend it to anybody. But all it told me was that when you condition somebody, particularly he deals with fear conditioning, the person has to already be afraid before they can be conditioned. In other words, if I gave a foot shock to a mouse, the pain always unconditionally arouses fear. So I've already frightened the mouse, and then I play a tone, and the rat will become afraid of that tone. And what Ledoux shows is that's entirely involuntary. You have no choice about that. And so I thought, well, that just told me the role of emotion in learning. You have to be in some sort of emotional state to be conditioned. And I was about to give up, but then I was living in England at the time, and in the year 2000, Mark Soames, I don't know if you've heard of him, brilliant guy. Oh, he's fabulous. You might consider having him on your podcast. He's wonderful. Okay. Anyway, he sort of founded this neuropsychoanalysis project, and they had their first symposium in London. So I went along, and Jaak was one of the keynote speakers. Wow. And I'll be honest, I didn't know what he was talking about. He showed animals in various states of sort of affective arousal. They were angry or sad or nurturing or lustful or something like that. And I thought, and I remember I didn't know what he was talking about, but I thought, I think this is a guy. I think this is the guy I've been looking for. So I bought his book and I read it. I'm sure you had trouble with it. I had trouble with it. I read it 3 times and I outlined it one time, the last time. Anyway, I was having some problems with things, and I emailed Jaak and asked him some questions, and he was very kind. He answered them for me. Wow. Anyway, I was head of this department of child and adolescent psychotherapy in Leicester, and I had the ability to ask him to come and speak, and he was coming to England in any case. So I said, well, can you come by and talk to us? And he said, okay. And he did. And anyway, we spent the weekend with him. And he told me he wanted to write a popular book. And I said to him, well, you want some help with it? And he said, yeah.
That's cool.
So that was just,
wow.
We did not write that popular book. We wrote an update of his first book. That's how it turned out. But I mean, my role in that book was to help Jaak get his message across as best I could. That's what I did. So that's in a way, I'm co-author, but that's really his book. And this book is a little bit more of an effort to clarify some of the questions. I didn't start it as a book. I just started outlining things because I just didn't understand. I thought Jaak was right. It felt like he was right, but I didn't really have any proof. And I thought, can you get any? And I fashioned an argument, which I think is pretty good. It's not airtight, but it's pretty good. It's the best I could do in any case.
Well, I spent a good part of Saturday reading it, thinking, going through and coming up with some questions. It really took some thought. Just connecting everything that I've been learning in this neuroscience certification course that I didn't understand. So, you know, if we could go to your book, the first 3 chapters, you discuss 3 different schools of thought about how emotions and affect. So if we could just talk about each one, and I like how you kind of outlined it with like a physical example of the gunshot. So I'll just start with like the first one is feedback theory, that you say effects emerge from cognitive parts of the cortex.
Yeah.
And so for example, you hear a gunshot and freeze, but why are we not afraid according to this feedback theory?
According to the feedback theory, which is a kind of a William James, you know, the great psychologist of the last century or 2 centuries ago, and a guy named, I can't remember his first name, Lang was his last name. Anyway, they kind of figured out it's an update of their theory. And their theory is that when something happens, a significant stimulus happens, you have an involuntary reaction, kind of like a reflex within your body. You know, stress chemicals pour into your bloodstream, you freeze, your pupils dilate, your hair stands on end, something like that with a frightening stimulus. And what they're saying is that's not fear. You don't feel a fear then. What happens is that all these responses are fed back to your cerebral cortex, the cognitive parts of your cortex, and it puts it all together and identifies all those reactions as fear. And then you feel frightened. So you don't run away because you're scared. You're scared because you run away.
So can you translate that into like students in the classroom or in a sports environment or in the workplace? How does this theory translate?
Well, I don't think it's true. So
okay.
I wouldn't bother.
Okay, let's not then. Let's go to the next one. And so the next one is brainstem theory. That is,
well, that's what I call
it. That's what you call it?
I just call it that. Just
that's what you call, okay.
For brevity.
And I call him Jack. That's how that. And he might have different pronunciation, but okay, I'll call him that. You might know him a different way, but I'll get all messed up if I change it because it's hard enough. So then brainstem theory is Jack's 7 emotional systems. And I didn't even notice. I've got them written out on my desk because I'm always looking at, where am I today in his emotions. I didn't even notice that he used all caps. But so he's saying that all mammals have these 7 emotions. And why do you think these 7 emotions were overlooked by those psychologists and neuroscientists if they appear in the upper brainstem, indicating that they came about a long time ago?
Well, he got recognized for it because he pulled them all together and he discovered a few of them. For example, he discovered the play system. He figured out about the seeking system. He was something. You talk about a rock star. Jaak was the rock star.
Wow.
He was something else. He had. I asked him one time, I said, how did you think of that? Why did that come to you? He had no idea.
Really?
We don't, because cognitive things are largely unconscious. And he said he felt sort of ready to discover it, which means he'd probably already figured it out unconsciously. And then it bubbled up and he figured it, and he knew he'd figured it out. But I mean, that's the way we learn. We study, and then you go to sleep, or you have a cocktail, or you do something relaxing. And then the next day you have a good idea.
Right.
The result of all that work and then unconsciously putting it together. But I mean, I think that's how it works for everybody. Doesn't matter if you're smart or don't. But I can't remember where. Oh, capital letters. You asked about capital letters.
Yeah.
He put them in capital letters to show these are real parts of the brain. Each system consists of identifiable brain structures. They're fueled by specific chemicals, and it's real. You see, other psychologists, we just come to these conclusions on the basis of things that people say to us and what we understand is really going on. But nobody has figured out such a broad taxonomy of emotions as Jaak has put together. So that's him. He put it together. And the reason nobody did it before is because they're not as smart as him.
Right. Right. So if we think about the gunshot with this brainstem theory, we hear a gunshot, what happens?
Well, what he says is that his point is that the 7, and other people agree with him, most notably Damasio, but he says these 7 emotional systems are located largely in and around the brainstem. There's projections up to the higher regions of the mind, of course, but the hub of them is located in and around the brainstem, particularly a structure called the periaqueductal gray, which is constructed in a way that it has 7 columns, which correspond to the 7 emotional systems. And so that's probably the hub of it, but nobody is absolutely sure. And but he says also that affects emerge also from deep subcortical structures in and around the brainstem. Now, demonstrating that that's the case, it takes a little more doing, and I try to do that in the book. And actually, once I saw a kind of clean sequence of experiments that demonstrated that in some sort of credible way, I thought to myself, "Oh no, I've got something here." And that's when I remember I talked to my husband about it. He said, you should write a book. And he made me promise that I would.
Wow.
That's why I did.
I love it. I love it. So if we were, because I know that you believe this one. So if we're going to think about this and we're teachers in the classroom, would it be that we want our students to be seeking and be curious with learning? How would you say that?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the big lessons. I was thinking about what you said, when you wrote to me your questions, what's the big thing that informs psychotherapy? One of the reasons why psychotherapists and neuroscientists have formed such a close alliance is because neuroscience corroborates the attachment theory. Attachment theory means that it's instinctive to crave a close relationship with a nurturing, protective caregiver, typically the mother. Mm-hmm. And it used to be thought, no, that's just because the mother provides food and care and so on and so forth. And it's basically a kind of what Freud described it as a kind of libidinal attachment. In other words, I love my mother because she makes me feel good, as opposed to I need my mother. This is something inside me. And neuroscience corroborated that. All mammals crave that. You deprive any mammal of that. And, you think about the Harlow studies with the monkeys, those poor little things. And, this poor little unmothered monkey would prefer a dummy monkey with a terry cloth covering than a wire one that had milk. So in other words, it craved that tactile comfort. Wow. So that's the big reason why psychotherapists and neuroscientists have formed this alliance. But what psychotherapists, I don't think, have fully appreciated is kind of the opposite of attachment, which is the seeking system. And the seeking system, it's the system that makes you want to do something on your own. It makes you want to understand it yourself. You don't just want to believe somebody else. You want to understand it. You want to do it. Don't help me. Let me do it. When a kid will say, no, don't help me. I want to try it. And you let them do it. Yeah. And if they fail, you might give them a suggestion on how to do it better. But I think the seeking system, particularly as an impetus toward proactive behavior and cure, I think is terribly important. And that was one of the things that I tried to emphasize.
So right in front of me, I've got that the desire to succeed with the seeking system, with extreme sports. I'm just trying to think of how people listening could think about, well, I have this emotion and it's driving me on my own to succeed in sports, succeed in the workplace, succeed in the classroom. How do we use it? What's the importance of knowing it's there? Is there an importance, or do we just know we have these 7 systems?
Sure. Anytime you encourage somebody, anytime you tell them what they're doing wrong, that they can correct. Mm-hmm. Anytime you do anything like that, you're encouraging the seeking system. Let's say you're a runner and you're not standing up straight enough, or you're doing something wrong. And I was your coach. I'd say, try it this way, do that, pump your arms differently, try that. I think it'll improve your speed. And you do it and you feel better. Now, you can say to me, thanks a lot for telling me, coach. And I'd say, you're welcome, and that's my job. But the point is, I've helped you to do it better for yourself.
And it's hardwired into me to do better.
And from then on, it's yours.
Got it. Do you think we covered brainstem theory? Is there anything else that I've missed with it?
Well, I can tell you what I could take you. I don't know, how are we doing on time? I don't even know.
So we're at maybe 20 minutes to go until the hour.
I won't do this because it'll take too much time.
Okay.
But I describe in the book that line of it's not chronological, but it is conceptual. But that line of experimental research, which demonstrates why it's credible to believe that affects emanate from subcortical structures. The main experiment was done in the middle of the last century. It was an experiment with cats. And prior to this time, everybody thought that the cerebral cortex, which generates thoughts, perceptions, ideas, everything, that was the seat of consciousness. Everybody thought that. And what these guys did, Maruzzi and Magoon, these two researchers, they destroyed a cat's cortex, but left the brainstem intact, and the cats remained awake. And then they did the opposite. Cats became completely comatose, destroyed the brainstem, left the cortex intact. They were comatose. And then they discovered that the reticular activating system in the brainstem, that's the part that generates awakeness. Now you say awakeness isn't the same as consciousness. And then you can say they discovered that a big part of consciousness is motivation. But what is motivation? Motivation is sensations of pleasure and pain, both physical and affective. Probably affects evolved out of physical pleasure and pain, because many of the structures overlap.
So what's important?
Physical pain have very overlapping structures, for example.
So if I was to wrap this one up, it's important to know we have 7 core emotions that are hardwired into our brain. And how do they help us? They help us.
Well, they probably evolved because they help us to adapt. I think it's important to say that this list is probably incomplete. People have suggested there's a social dominance system. Also that there's a disgust system. You'd think there would be, because all animals, for example, express disgust at noxious food or something like that.
Right.
But I don't. That remains to be discovered.
Got it. Well, let's move on to the third theory, conceptual acts theory, that claims that emotional systems do not exist and that emotions do not emanate from any brain region. Affects depend on concepts we construct largely on the basis of social experience. Yeah. And so anyone who's read Lisa Feldman Barrett's theory of constructed emotions would attach her to this one. Is that right?
That's hers.
So with a gunshot, how would you explain your reaction if emotions don't exist in your brain according to
what she says is it works like this. When there's a stimulus, you have a physical reaction. A lot of times you don't even notice it. But if you do notice it, you don't know what it means. It can mean anything. She uses the example that if you have a contracting stomach when you're in a bakery, you think, oh, I'm hungry. If you're out and about in flu season, you think, oh, no, I'm nauseous because maybe I have symptoms of flu. If you're in a doctor's office waiting test results, you say it's anxiety because I'm scared something bad would be wrong with me. And what she says is, through the course of our lives, we develop concepts about affects. And we develop it because if I'm your kid and I see you get scared, or if I hear you talk about, oh, I'm really scared of this, then I understand what fear means. And then when something, let's say, scary happens and I have this physical reaction, I go, that's fear. It's very similar to the feedback theory, except for the fact that feedback theory accepts about emotional systems. And actually, Jaak and Lisa Feldman Barrett were frequently at loggerheads with each other about this.
Yeah.
She hit him pretty hard. And
really?
Yeah, she really did. She wrote a few papers, pretty much taking a full swing at him. And, well, in order to understand her argument, she gives a lot of evidence, and I go through it point by point. Mm-hmm. That was actually a lot of work. And I go through it point by point, and I don't think the research that she presents is sufficient or sometimes even credible to make her points. So that's how I go through that.
So would it be accurate to say that her point is that and this conceptual act theory is that our emotions are invented using our memory? Would that be accurate? Kind of, right?
Yeah, constructed.
Constructed.
That's how she puts it. So you could say invented, but not invented from scratch. Invented from, in other words, if I invent something, well, I don't suppose anyone invents something from scratch, but I construct it. I make it up. I figure it out from my experience.
So from what I'm hearing, I don't think you believe this one. You believe Jaak Panksepp's brainstem theory, that our emotions are.
Oh yeah, that's why one of the reasons why I wrote the book is because I thought I could, this argument, which I say I think is pretty good, it supports him.
Got it.
So after I've talked about these three different hypotheses about the creation of affects, I give an argument in favor of his and Damasio's, to be fair.
Got it. And that brings me into chapter 5 and 6. You look at Jaak Panksepp and Damasio explaining how effects might be created. Both are similar, involving the brainstem, but they have different mechanisms. So, and then here's where it gets hard for me, because, this is where it goes into what I don't understand and what I haven't learned yet. But Damasio's view involves homeostasis and consciousness. So can you explain Damasio versus Panksepp's point of view here?
Yeah, well, Damasio says, he presents a sort of a hypothetical mechanism where he says the homeostasis of the body, and that's purely physical. A lot of people, when you talk about homeostasis, they take it as metaphorical. In other words, do I feel good or something? Homeostasis has to do with, let's say, the amount of calcium in your body, how it's working. It has to do with your temperature. It has to do with your circadian rhythms. It has to do, all physical, how your body stays alive. And it turns out that these factors, all these homeostatic factors, have to be kept in a pretty narrow margins. In other words, if my temperature went up 5 degrees, I'd be pretty damn sick. And so I don't have a lot of leeway, and you don't have a lot of leeway with any of these things. And he says there's this part of the brain, which he calls the protoself, which monitors homeostasis. And the protoself, according to the mechanism, which I'm not going to go into because it's kind of complicated, the protoself eventually interprets this homeostasis as a feeling state, as an affect. It can be just a physical feeling state, not pain, pleasure, something hurts me, physically, something feels good physically, and it also can be interpreted as an affect. And so this absolute tight link between homeostasis and affect is absolutely essential to Damasio. And he also says that all our behavior is an effort to maintain homeostasis. In other words, everything that I do, I want to feel good. I want to feel as good as I possibly can. So all my behavior is an effort. And that's where I challenge him, because it's not true. Take maternal behavior. You feel maternal behavior is characterized, maternal, let's say, nurturing behavior, and it's not limited to mothers. I don't wish to give that impression. But nurturing behavior is characterized by the secretion of very chemicals, oxytocin, particularly, but feel-good chemicals. And when you're nurturing somebody, you do feel good. We always feel good when we're helping somebody. And sometimes you can help somebody when you're hungry or when you're thirsty or when you're sad or something like that, but it'll still make you feel good, or at least it'll make you feel better. So your behavior isn't driven entirely by homeostasis. Mothers will put themselves, and let's say Look at the people who looked after us during the pandemic. I was talking to a few of them a couple of weeks ago, and they came in every day. They risked their lives for us, and they were proud of it. It was a source of self-esteem and of course immense gratitude. I mean, think of how you feel when you've done something good for somebody.
Yeah, have you heard of Damasio coining the term interoception? That's the only
interoception just means perceiving stuff that's going on inside you. And that's interoception, of course, is, if you're monitoring your homeostasis, interoception is the way you do it, I guess.
Self-awareness, know your body, know your self.
Except affect regulation is not, or affective expression is just not that simple. It's something else. Maybe it's usually homeostatically driven. Maybe it is sometimes homeostatically driven, but not always. Now, Jaak has a mechanism. He presents it very briefly, and I asked him about it, and he didn't have that much to say about it, and which makes me not that impressed with it, to be honest. But he says that the creation of affects takes place entirely in the brain. What he's saying is you get global synchronous firing of neurons in emotional systems, and somehow this resonates with the parts of the brain which nobody knows what they are, that generate affects, and it creates some sort of resonance, and that's how it works. So it all takes place in the brain, and it's independent of homeostasis. And I don't know about the mechanism, because I have nothing to say about that, because I don't know. But but he's certainly right sometimes that it's independent of homeostasis.
So all the research in the first 7 chapters of your book show how the brain creates conscious affective feelings. Is that correct? How our brain...
Well, I think it's a stretch to say I show it. My only point was just to demonstrate that they are subcortically created. That's all.
Okay, so saying that in English, that they exist in the brain, right? Just to go a different layer. And so now you mentioned, I loved the research parts, and I know it must have taken so long for you to put it all in. But there was Ramachandran in there, and he's come up on our podcast with this Harvard researcher. We talked about the dream world. Oh, it was just, I had a blast talking with him.
Yeah, and that was good.
He studied with Ramachandran, and so it's just amazing when I see all the research come in. That's why I'm getting so excited. I call you guys all rock stars, because we're learning from you and trying to see how can we improve our lives better. So, where did Ramachandran cites that people with male bodies feel like men and people with female bodies feel like women? What was the whole point?
Well, what Rama was saying was, forgive me for being so familiar with him, but I never met him or anything. But what he says is that identity is not whole. It's not holistic. It's not a whole thing. He said there's strands of identity, and 2 of the strands, for example, are your physical body and your mental state. In other words, you can look like a woman and think you're a man, or feel like you are a man somehow, and the reverse also. And most of the time, it links up. Now there is some research actually that Jaak did, although that Ramachandran doesn't cite it. But I don't. It's just on mice. It turns out that if a pregnant mouse is stressed, the release of hormones can be skewed in such a way that the development of the brain and the development of the body are opposite. You can have a male brain, female body, male body, female brain. So I hope I got that right. Anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, and what he found, he doesn't describe it very well, but he found that the offspring of some of these mothers showed bisexual, homosexual tendencies. Now, that is not transgenderism, as I understand it. But he said they also seem to develop traits of the opposite sex, but he doesn't go into it. So I don't really know.
Okay.
But that's some research that sort of might explain what transgenderism is all about, because it seems to be a thing, not nearly as pervasive a thing as the news would have you believe. It's a very, very small percentage of the population. But that was the point that Ramachandran made.
Got it. And then here we go to the hard question of consciousness.
Oh, yeah.
I know we talked on email, but I've been interested in consciousness, trying to even take a stab of exploring it. I have this National Geographic, and the scientists say that some scholars reckon the puzzle of consciousness is something the human mind is incapable of solving.
Well, it's an apples and oranges thing. You say, how can this lump of flesh between our ears, it's just stuff, how can it give rise to the way you feel when you smell a flower, curiosity, sorrow, anything? How can conscious experience emanate from this jellied mass in our skulls?
Right.
And you see, you can't explain. You could say, how could a mouse give birth to a kangaroo? It can't. So how can this physical thing create that non-physical thing? And that's essentially the hard question of consciousness, and nobody has remotely answered it. The only reason we think it does is from lesion experiments. In other words, if you destroyed my the optical parts of my brain, I'd be blind. Same with the auditory. You destroyed my prefrontal cortex, I'd be stupid. That's the way it works. And every single time it works that way. So we're pretty sure about that. But this asks the opposite question, which is, how can a conscious experience change the physical brain? That's even sort of more freaky. But it's been shown to be true. It's been shown to be true. And these are experiments. You'd like to read Michael Gazzanica's book, Who's in Charge, if you're interested in the consciousness question. It's a lot of fun.
Okay.
He writes really well. It's kind of believe it or not, it's kind of an easy read and very informative.
Got it.
Yeah, I think you'd enjoy it.
And so does that even tie into how does meditation change the brain and our health?
I don't know. I don't know about meditation because I don't know anything about it. I tried it a few times and got terribly bored and gave up.
Okay. Got it.
It's not, clearly it's not for me.
Sure.
But for example, suppose you got a letter, said you won the lottery, you're getting $10 million.
Nice.
Well,
yeah.
You'd get pretty excited.
Yeah.
It's not the words written on the page. It's not just looking at the squiggles on a page that excited you. You read this thing, you obtained an idea. A windfall is coming my way. And that idea got you all excited. Now, what directs your heartbeats and everything? Now, what directs all that? Your brain. So this idea impacted on your brain. But this is one of the things that we know. Whenever you learn anything at all, it's a new neural pathway in your brain. For example, think about those conditioning experiments that I was talking about, about half an hour ago. Where you shock to the foot and the auditory tone. Why do you become afraid of the tone? Because a new neural pathway is created, but it's created to the central from the lateral amygdala, which is where all the sensory information comes through initially, to the central nucleus of the amygdala, and the central nucleus of the amygdala inaugurates the fear response. And that neural pathway is created for the first time. And furthermore, unless you decondition the mouse, that mouse will remain afraid of that tone for the rest of its life.
And so in your book, it looks like you've got a strong case for brainstem theory. And then at the very end, in chapter 10, you show how neuroscience helped you to treat those two boys with the seeking system. Right. Yeah. So how did you help each boy differently, knowing when to act like a coach or a traditional therapist with those 7 emotional systems?
Well, as I say, it was mainly the seeking system that I was trying to utilize to help him get better. But the one kid, the teenager who was depressed, he was a kind of useless kid, really, in terms of his use to society. He didn't study, smoked quite a bit of pot. He wasn't addicted to it heavily, but he smoked it when he just wanted to feel a little bit better. He was a member of a band. He never practiced. He was supposed to meet his friends. He wouldn't show up. He had a girlfriend. He never took her anywhere. And yet at the same time, so everyone was disappointed in him. His teachers didn't think much of him, and he was deeply offended because he had this idea he was very, very sensitive and so on. Anyway, I interpreted along the usual lines, trying to help him understand why he was so sort of angry and resentful. And he agreed with me. The only thing is, it didn't do any good. He didn't get better at all. If anything, he might have gotten a little worse. But anyway, progress was not being made. And then he had a bad experience. He overheard or heard about some friends of his who were slagging him off, and about something which I described, but it doesn't matter what it was. And they were all saying he was a real pain in the ass. And he had behaved in a way, and I said to him, I said, you're not stupid. You understand other people. I said, why didn't you see it coming? It was bound to happen from the way you were behaving. And then it sort of hit him. And it was very important to do that. It's like when you say to somebody, run differently. And I said to him, don't you see what you've done? Don't you see what's happened? Now, I couldn't have said this to him if he didn't know me well, because I always liked him. And I think he knew that. And we always got on really well. And even when he was, not making any progress and kind of just using me to validate himself, we had a good relationship. And so when I said this to him, he took it. And he took it from somebody he trusted. And that was actually the beginning of his improvement. Now, the other child, the little boy, he was only 8 or 9. And actually, both these cases are an amalgam, by the way. I didn't present just a case history. But this was a boy who'd had a medical intervention when he was about 4 years old, 3 or 4. And I don't know, he could remember a tiny bit about it, but not much. But it had obviously sensitized his fear system because I knew about that. That absolutely guided the way I treated him. Now, the funny thing is, I remember the first time this happened, you get phobic patients on a regular basis as in psychotherapy. But I remember the very first time it happened, it was, usually what you interpret, what we were taught to interpret is that children have edible fantasies. They want to marry their mother. They're afraid of retaliation for that. I would have, ordinarily maybe said something about that. I didn't say anything about it. Not a word. I said, if you're scared, something must have scared you. And it seems to me from what Mommy told me that it was this. And then the question is now, how can we get over it? And the way you get over it is just you start trying things that scare you in a way that's in a safer environment and so on. That's how we did it. But I remember sitting in my office and thinking, well, why did I do that so differently? And I felt my decisions were right, but I thought, well, what made me decide those things? And I couldn't figure it out. I mean, since then, it must have been reading Jaak and knowing about the fear system, knowing about sensitization, all those things. That isn't Jaak's main thing, but I had read about it in any case. And that's what guided me. And that little boy was basically cured in 3 sessions. His parents did most of the work in terms of acclimatizing him to things that frightened him, but that was really all it took.
So how do you think an understanding of the brain helped him with that? If we, brain, emotions, how did these 2 young boys get helped faster?
The first boy, when I confronted him with what he did, the teenager, with what he'd done, they'd been such a pain, so sort of annoying and a sort of hostile, covertly hostile. When he saw that, he thought, I don't want to be like that. Oh, I am like that. He saw it for the first time. Oh, I am like that. And I said, yeah, you are. That's why people get pissed off with you.
He got to understand himself.
And then, how that's so important, the way other people see you or how you think if anybody's ever going to like you. It's so terribly important. And so he wanted to change. And the funny thing is, he'd always complained that the girlfriend I was talking about, she broke up with him quite quickly because, he was a lousy boyfriend. But he was always saying, girls aren't interested in me. It's because he had a miserable expression and his posture was terrible. And the funny thing is, 2 months after this happened, a girl fell in love with him. And he fell in love with her.
Because he got his own self-esteem.
Yeah, I noticed it. His facial expression changed. He stood up straight. And he was worthy of being loved, of being fallen in love. And I remember he was so amazed. First time you fall in love and somebody falls in love with you, it is quite amazing that anybody could feel that way.
Right.
Or somebody else about you.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it was a lovely relationship.
Oh, Lucy, you've done some phenomenal work. Just to kind of close things up here, how would you like to sum up your book and the work that you've done and spearheading this field? I still see you as a rock star in this field. But how would you like to close this for people listening? What should we take away?
I said at the beginning, I said that neuroscience isn't difficult. And what I mean by that is that it's not difficult to understand a particular piece of research. It might seem difficult, but if you just take your time, you can understand it. It's quite mechanistic. You can figure it out. You sometimes have to look up terms and stuff like that, but if you're prepared to do that, you can. Because in and of itself, it's not so difficult. The problem is there is so much information and so many conclusions that people come to, and they're different. And they're all very persuasive. And that was what I wrote the book about, because I just couldn't make a case for anything or a case against anything. You read somebody like Ledoux, he's so brilliant. And even though I don't think he has the idea about consciousness right, his research is so fantastic. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference.
Right.
And so, but that's what the book is about. It's trying to help you to take away and see the big picture, which was what I was after, what I wanted to do, without any, without pulling any punches.
Well, Lucy, this has been phenomenal. I want to thank you so much. First of all,
I've had a great time.
Me as well. This is just like chatting with an old friend whose absolutely. Book I devoured, like word for word. But
this is the first time we've ever met.
No, exactly. But I feel like I know you because, famous in my eyes. But, just thank you for sending me that note. It was before the holiday, and I knew immediately who you were. It came across my computer, and of course I screamed a little bit over here because it's like that. In my eyes, you are a rock star. Like Daniel Siegel, who wrote the foreword to the Archeology of Mind, suggested that scientists and researchers...
that was a great interview you did with him, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I was nervous back then.
That was great.
My first year I was dying, but that was fun. So he talked about how readers that go through this, if you're interested in all those academic references, clinicians, educators, can get all the research, but for the rest of us that don't need the research, just read the book like it's a non-fictional story to help digest Archeology of Mind and into yours. I think that helps us all to just understand that eventually the terms will sink in. So I want to thank you so much for the change, the research, the change in the world you've made, and for everything you've shared today. Thank you so much. For people that want to reach you, is the best way, do you have a website or?
I don't have a website. You can just reach me by my email, lucybiven@gmail.com, all lowercase.
Perfect. And I'll put all the links to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure.